consistently what we've seen is no shortage of interest in solving the financial challenges of workers, but a lot of the solutions that are deployed, I think, without that full contextual understanding of what's happening. And so then we get questions like, well, no one's using these things that we've deployed. And while it's easy to then say, well, that must be a failure, and it very well could be, our question back is always, well, how many people needed it? Are you providing the solutions that are actually meeting the needs of your workforce?
Leadership Story Talks, where we discuss the practices that engage, motivate, develop, retain, and attract people to businesses. We'll give you principles and tools based on real-world stories to leverage listening and storytelling to become a better leader and management professional. Leadership Story Talks is produced by Narrative, a company that focuses on personal storytelling for business.
Welcome to Leadership Story Talks. I'm Jerome DeRoy, CEO of Narrative.
I'm Julienne Ryan, and it's great to be here.
So before we move on to introduce our guest, I want to remind our listeners to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, because that's how word of mouth works, and check out our YouTube channel in this episode's notes, as well as narrative.com, narrativ.com/podcast, where you can find all of our previous episodes. We also have a workshop coming up beginning in February, starting February 15, where it's going to be 4 60-minute sessions for 4 weeks. You can go to narrative.com to enroll and learn more about that as well. So I am very excited today to introduce our first returning guest, Matt Bahl. I'm going to read the bio here that I've got, and then we'll get into our conversation. So as Vice President, Workplace Market Lead at the Financial Health Network, Matt builds relationships with employers committed to advancing financial health for their workforces. In his role, Matt leads the development of new capabilities, strategies, and partnerships to help employers achieve their financial health goals. He works with stakeholders across the workplace community to spread awareness about solutions and cultivate connections within the broader financial health ecosystem. Nationally recognized thought leader on workplace financial wellness, Matt previously served as head of financial wellness customer success at Prudential. Matt also oversaw a team of HR leaders at Maine Health, charged with improving employee well-being, engagement, and benefit optimization, and served as a labor and employment lawyer, advising organizations on a broad range of matters. So great introduction here. Lots of experience, and with that through line of financial wellness, and of course our connection, Matt and I, we worked together in the context of your role at Prudential around telling a story about financial wellness that would be impactful for the audience. I'm really delighted to have you back on the show almost 3 years later. Amazing.
And on that note, when Jerome said it was almost 3 years, I just couldn't believe it because time has just whipped through. So I am sure a lot has happened, and we're curious to hear how that's all the things that have gone in between our last podcast and now, what's happened, and where has it taken your work in the conversations you've been having?
Yeah, I think, we don't have 8 hours to unpack the last 3 years. So we'll have to do the best we can to streamline that, but certainly a lot has happened, and I'm eager to dive in with you all.
Great.
Terrific. Thank
Maybe
you.
we can start with just, since it has been a little while, maybe giving a refresher to our audience and to those listeners that are new, because our podcast was just starting at the time. Maybe give us a little refresher about how you got to be doing this work around financial health and financial wellness.
Sure. Well, just based on the bio you read, it would appear that I can't hold a job for very long because I've switched so many times. But I think in truth, there's been a consistent through line in my work, which is I'm deeply fascinated and committed to ensuring that work is better for more people. And I've done this work both as a legal advisor, as an HR executive, as a benefits leader, and now really working at the Financial Health Network, which is a 501c3 nonprofit whose mission is to improve financial health for all. And through all of those different career trajectories, one of the common themes was really trying to understand how do we make work better for both the people that I was helping advise, the people that I was helping lead, and now how do we actually start to shape systems that are so important in order to move forward financial health. And that's really the work that's consumed me over the last 3 years, and has been the evolution of our work is really deepening our understanding of what is this workplace system. Who are the stakeholders? How does it function? What are the incentives? And how do we start to think about ways to reorient some of those practices and thought models? I know we're going to talk about mental models in a bit, but really, how do we get folks thinking innovatively around what's happening in work? And I think the last 3 years have been, in some ways, calls to action. Some places are listening more closely than others, I would say.
For
No
sure.
question, the nature of work has really transformed at a rapid pace over the last 3 years.
Yeah. I wonder, maybe going back to the, the origin point of the conversation here, in terms of that through line you were discussing, right? The financial health through line, and actually making the workplace better, or making work better. And I remember that from our first conversation, that was the goal. And I'm curious, in terms of this financial health term, it's interesting. I don't know if it's one of those things where, I hadn't heard so much about it before meeting you, and then suddenly it feels like in the last 3, it's everywhere, and especially I think in the context that we were talking about last time, which was the Great Resignation and how do we retain people. Of course, now we're in a very different situation, but still there is. I don't think that motivation of retention and recruiting the right talent, et cetera, has gone away. And I'm sure that for people out there who are, getting into new jobs, et cetera, and do have a choice, that must come into play. And so what do we mean by financial health? And how much of that plays a part in terms of the choices that employees have in your view?
Yeah, several different parts to that question, so I'll try to unpack them in sequence. But we define financial health as coming about when one's daily financial life, including their workplace, allows them to build resiliency and thrive. So, at the Financial Health Network, we don't just focus on workplace financial health. We focus on the broader financial health ecosystem, banks, credit unions, fintechs, investors, et cetera. And we think that's important because I think in the workplace context, there has always been, or had been for a long time, this assumption that people would walk into the 4 walls of a workplace before remote work was a thing. And they would sort of flip a switch and they were just, workers and not human beings that had lives outside of that. And so some of the work over the last 3 years has been really helping to connect what's happening in people's broader financial lives and how that shows up in the workplace. And we think that's really important for employers to understand, because consistently what we've seen is no shortage of interest in solving the financial challenges of workers, but a lot of the solutions that are deployed, I think, without that full contextual understanding of what's happening. And so then we get questions like, well, no one's using these things that we've deployed. And while it's easy to then say, well, that must be a failure, and it very well could be, our question back is always, well, how many people needed it? Are you providing the solutions that are actually meeting the needs of your workforce? And if you're not, then it's hard to sort of evaluate what constitutes a workplace financial health program. And I think COVID and the pandemic and the resulting 3 years shined a light on just the material deficits that so many workers face. Through some of our partners like Just Capital, certainly any number of other sort of independent insights, we consistently see that the status quo for so many workers is just material deficit. And so many of the early financial wellness programs that employers were deploying were sort of not paying attention to that. And so you say, well, we're just going to offer some education classes and call it financial wellness. And most of the evidence on those types of things are that they're just not that effective. And they become more effective over time as people get as their material lives become better. And that's part of the work that we've consistently done, is really disentangling sort of the way that workplaces have been focusing on financial health and wellness and how we've seen that evolve. And I think right now we're at an inflection point where the last 3 years you saw rapid creation of new workplace solutions, new sort of products and widgets. That certainly has contracted, particularly as the interest rates have gone up and venture capital funding has become less cheap. There's been less sort of new innovation coming to the market. But nonetheless, it's really reoriented many workplaces, not nearly enough, but many workplaces to say, are we even conceiving of financial health and wellness in the right ways? Is it really just about a retirement plan and some education? Or is it really more about all the different ways in which we support the material lives of our people? And those are the types of conversations that we've really seen evolve and change over the last 3 years.
And it doesn't have to be answered now, maybe later on. I know many client companies have contracted and let go a substantial number of their workforce. So, and it's not just about who's been displaced, but who remains, that you have to manage their uncertainty or their concerns. So at some point, if you can touch on that, I'd be appreciative. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to touch on that now.
Mhm.
It's been a wildly weird economy over the last 3 years. And all of the so-called experts would have said, hey, those government infusions and that COVID spending, that's going to crash the economy. And it didn't. And despite people seeming to want to wish a recession into place, it never really materialized, at least in the way that we've understood recessions previously. And so you certainly did see, for example, some high-profile industries announcing job cuts, tech in particular, certainly finance, you saw some, but you saw massive growth in other industries, service industries, construction, manufacturing is making a real comeback. Over 800,000 new manufacturing jobs have been added. And so contrary to the last 40 plus years where the service jobs and the manufacturing jobs were taking a hit, it's actually more white collar jobs that have been impacted
Interesting.
over the last 3 years. And so it created this narrative in, I think, the broader system, like, geez, there's something going wrong here. And if you look at all the macro numbers, it just didn't really align. So you would see record levels of low unemployment. You saw real wage growth going up. Maybe not as much during the inflationary period, but this is the first time we've seen people at the bottom of the wage scale actually see real wage growth. And that's only going to continue to accelerate to the extent that inflation can continue to come down. And so it's been one of those things where there's sort of whiplash in terms of how do we actually anchor ourselves. And I think you raise a really important point, Julienne, because so many of the financial wellness solutions and programs over the years have been geared towards white collar professionals. And they've not necessarily been geared towards or designed for frontline workers or, to use the throwback term from the pandemic, essential workers. And I think that's caused a lot of really interesting trends, or I wouldn't say cause, but it's contributed to interesting trends, which is we just see growing numbers of the US workforce yelling about their discontent of the status quo. And there are some markers you can point to. And that certainly is contributed by just a low unemployment environment. But, this is the first time in my lifetime where we are likely, we won't know yet, but to see union density go up. You're seeing industries that historically had been sort of immune from union organizing efforts that have been, organized. You saw record numbers of strikes over the last year and a half. And so you have all of this evidence of workers expressing their discontent with the workplace status quo, much of which is focused on sort of the financial precarity that was part and parcel of their work lives over the last 40 years. And you can look at historical data and, there's some, just shocking charts you can look at, real numbers, not made up numbers, where, from the late 70s and the early 80s, really from the 1940s up through that period of time, late 70s, early 80s, as our economy was more productive, meaning we generated more value, real wages tended to rise in tandem. Well, then during the 1980s, as we sort of overly financialized so many parts of our economy, we still created a huge amount of value, but for the vast majority of workers, their wages simply stagnated. And at the same time, we also saw that rising costs of essential goods, housing, transportation, healthcare, food, skyrocketed way above the average growth in wages. And so you'll have certain, ways of thinking about the economy in terms of consumer price indices and this sort of bundle of goods. But in some ways that obscures the material reality that so many people face, which is food's more expensive, housing's nearly impossible to get in front of. My healthcare has gone up. There was a great study just released on the growing cost of healthcare. If you were a worker from between 1988 and 2019, $125,000 of your wages went towards paying for healthcare. And that's as healthcare costs went from 7.9% of your wages in 1988 to, in some cases, 28.5% for workers in low-wage jobs. So you have all of these factors happening, and you have this momentum in the workplace market of, well, we've always sort of done benefits this way. So we're going to continue benefits this way. And what we're seeing now is workers saying that no longer works for us. And so if you're not going to change, and we're going to be in a position where we don't feel like we're being heard, we're not being understood, the working conditions aren't as optimal, well, it's no surprise that you're seeing increased unionization, particularly as unions themselves have really accelerated their organizing efforts. So I think there's all of these sort of indicators. They're not talked about a lot because it's sort of below the radar for a lot of the narratives around work in the workplace, which is just overly focused on white-collar workers. But this is happening underneath, and it's having massive effects across the economy. And you're starting to see slowly employers really rethinking, geez, have we been approaching this total rewards design? Have we've been approaching our talent retention strategies in ways that actually align with how work was just completely shook up. So I think that's sort of where we are and how I sort of diagnose the economy.
And where's been where has the focus been? Because I think that's thank you for that answer, because I mean, I myself, I went to business school, and I consider myself, and I worked in finance for a little while, and I consider myself pretty well, pretty knowledgeable about these things, and yet there's something really confounding about the headlines of the last couple of years, where there is this dynamic, and I think you really put it very well. There's this dynamic of like everything that we know from before tells us that we're heading towards a recession. And then the very next day, and it's going to happen just tomorrow, 6 months from now, it's going to happen. And then the very next day, you see these super low unemployment, numbers. And then the day after that, you see that Amazon or Google has just laid off 1,000 people or more, right? And these big percentages. But I think what I find fascinating about your response here are things that we're kind of all thinking about, because we see these smaller headlines, like the unionization, right? That seems to be going up. Oh, that's interesting. And then you don't really hear anything about it anymore. But for me, something kind of really crystallized when you mentioned the focus on the white collar workers. That seems to really resonate for me and from what I'm seeing. And at the expense of, we're not focusing on the blue collar workers, which is really where that boom is kind of happening. But what's happening to their wages? They're stagnating, right? So maybe this is a good time to talk about this, because I don't necessarily remember from our first conversation you talking about these kind of mental models as much as you do now. And you talked a little bit earlier about, looking at systemic changes. What are the systems that are in place that we can sort of gradually start to change? And so, but maybe going back to that, what do you mean by mental model? And, what does that mean in the context of what you spoke about and your work?
Yeah. So you can Google the definition of mental model and come across all sorts of things.
Right.
There's a definition in like psychology. There's a definition in sort of, structural systems change. And the way that I think about mental models is really, it's like there's this deeply held sense of beliefs and assumptions that dictate how you view and approach the world. And it's through those models you architect that it largely dictates sort of how you end up engaging. I also think that those mental models and shifting those is a necessary prerequisite to actually driving some sort of systemic change. And so from our perspective, or my perspective, that's what we mean by mental models. Is like, what's the operating software that so many workplaces use today? It's not comporting, because we're seeing all of this agitation all around the workplace that's clearly not working for the workers at scale. Yet we're still continuing to see the sort of same application of this, what I would consider outdated software. So how do we upgrade that software? How do we reframe some of the ways in which workplaces orient themselves to their workforce? And in doing so, how does that then facilitate into broader systems change around work just being better for more people? So to me, I think in some ways the mental model it's a prerequisite. And so, over the next several years, as we've really, as an organization at the Financial Health Network, have sort of really gut checked ourselves, like, what is our theory of change? Like, how do we actually drive this? And we've really, I think, come to this idea that we have to start thinking about upgrading mental models. And there's all sorts of tactical ways in which you can do that. But for the work that I lead around workplace, it's that mental model. And just to TLDR it, because I'm hip and can use phrases like TLDR, even though I don't really know what it means. But the young people use it. It's like,
Good. We need more young people to listen.
Yeah, how do we get employers out of, not to sort of rhetorically say this, but to actually do it, to say that their workers are not risks to be managed, but humans worthy of investment and dignity. And that is a fundamental shift in, I think, the way that benefits are designed and oriented in a lot of contexts. I mean, you just look at a balance sheet. Where do workers show up? Where they're on the liability side. Yet you see in virtually every public proxy statement, workers are our most important, asset or whatever. Well, it doesn't always align. That rhetoric doesn't always align. In fact, I think it's more the exception for that rhetoric to align with the actions of the company. And not, again, you're then seeing workers agitating all around saying, no, like, we are humans. We are those generating value for the company. We are those driving the business forward. We should have a bigger say. We should be taken into account to a far greater degree and not simply be a number on a spreadsheet that is used to justify, expenses or treated as a risk to be managed. And while it may sound simple, oh yeah, workers are not risks to be managed. It's actually there's a whole industry set up that does just that. And so as we think about influencing the mental models of the ecosystem, that's what we're talking about. Like, how do we get all these different stakeholders who swim in the workplace water to think differently about workers and their role and their value? And then how do we think about optimizing that value in ways that also, of course, don't throw the entire economy into disarray? And I think we've just swung too far in the direction of, frankly, shareholder supremacy. I think that it is often comes at the expense of the people that are generating value. And certainly seeing lots of activity trying to rebalance that, but it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of insight and a lot of practice to sort of move towards that new mental model.
Well, since you are very good at surveying what's data and how companies are looking at their people, you mentioned young people, and I thought, well, here's a scenario we didn't see many in our generation or before. We had expenses for college, but we didn't have the incredible debt that going to colleges require now, and that it's getting untouchable. Secondly, the other thing we didn't see in at least my generation, you didn't come back home. That was the last place you would go to. If you had to, you would for a short period. But more and more people are living with their families for extended periods of time. So that's a different work unit that your employees are part of. Like my brother-in-law in Long Island, they have 2 post-college kids. One is finishing. By day, they are like a mini corporate office. They each one have a space that they're working for their clients or their work, and then they go and become, a regular family again. But they are lucky and fortunate, but they represent humans and what's going on behind the scenes about what's the value people are looking for in their employer, or at least a partnership in figuring how we can make success happen for our families. So are you seeing that kind of education or information gathering? Like, what does a family unit look like in my organization? What are they really experiencing? Do we know this?
Yeah, such an astute question. Sort of couple of different thoughts. Student loan debt is a scourge. Like, it's just absolute poison. Scott Galloway, the professor at NYU, wrote a book called America Adrift, and it's 100 charts, and he tracks sort of the rising costs of college compared to the wage boost. And, he says in his book that colleges seem to be acting more like hedge funds than place of higher learning. And I think as we've overly financialized our educational system, it's no surprise that despite having billions of dollars in endowments for some of these institutions, they're still charging extremely high costs for people to attend. Even if you were to eliminate all of the student loan debt today, right, just wipe it out, the debt would reconstitute in about a decade. And so the challenge is not necessarily, and I put this in the context of a workplace, because employers are the ones that are now sort of like, well, geez, we have all these students that have student loan debt, but it's expensive to offer student loan benefits. Like, why are they doing that? The reality is that student loan debt is going to continue to be a problem until we figure out what we want to do with higher education. And, I go back to my own experience. I'm a first generation college student. So I was the first person in my family to go to school. And the reality is, I was told growing up, hey, your path to success, go to school, get a job, and you're going to be set. That is your path to the middle class. Well, increasingly, that's not the case, right? Increasingly, you have people that are going to college, getting out, and they're making $30,000, $40,000 a year with $60,000 worth of debt. And so in some ways, young people, I think, are awakening that they're sort of getting not the bargain that they were told was there, which certainly adds, I think, to some of the discontent. And I think we need to be more creative. And there are some companies doing really amazing things around apprenticeships. I live in a small town on the coast of Maine, and we have the Mid-Coast School of Technology that does amazing work helping equip the next generation of HVAC professionals, electricians, plumbers. We need all of those things. And I think we have to, as part of this system that we're thinking about, is we have to think more creatively about how people can achieve a good life. And if the path we tell people is we have to go to college in order to achieve that, then you're just going to continue to find ways where people are deeply indebted. Maybe college isn't the right fit for everyone. It's not where they see their life trajectory. And so to me, like, that's a huge systemic problem. I give you that sort of perspective because it shows up at the workplace. All of a sudden you've got, folks of different generations who paid for their college. In part, they could afford to pay for their college because, you could work a job back in the 70s and pay for your tuition at a state school. We can't do that anymore. And so then you have this tension within the workplace of, hey, and this is part of that mental model for employers, which is, well, if we can't offer a benefit that applies to everyone, we really can't offer a benefit, despite all the exceptions to that, right? Executives can get stock ownership, but not those who are not executives. Within the federal employment laws, people over the age of, I think, 50 or 55 can contribute additionally to a retirement plan. So despite the fact that we have exceptions in the workplace, it's a convenient shield from saying we're not going to find ways to provide more targeted solutions for different segments of our population. And I think there are good reasons for having that debate. I don't think it's as clean as maybe hopefully I'm articulating as simple as just doing that, because it's not. Like, it's a much more complicated question. But yeah, young people are showing up and their needs are not being met. And their financial challenges are vastly different than different generations. If you go back and you were to look at the cost of a home in 1950, if you were just to adjust the cost to take a home in 1950, and you simply applied just normal inflation, cost adjusted to 2020-ish or so, that home would be about $85,000 today. The average home cost is about $400,000. And so this speaks to sort of the overly financialization of aspects of our life that often were associated with a thriving middle class. And increasingly, those are just becoming luxury items that are unaffordable to huge swaths of the US population. And so, you see these top line macro numbers like, geez, the stock market's performing well, GDP growth is up, unemployment is low. And it's like, yeah, all of those that's right. And those are all traditional markers. And yet, why are so many people, particularly young people, feeling discontent with the economy? Well, it could be that 10% of US households own 89% of the stock. So when the stock market goes up, it's not benefiting 89% of the people to the same extent it's benefiting, the top 10% of households. People aren't seeing those values. People can't afford to get into a home like their parents could. People are coming out with massive amounts of debt, not able to pursue careers that they think would be fulfilling and rewarding. And so they look at these top line numbers, and while those are certainly macroeconomic indicators that have long been associated with the thriving economy, and I think we have certainly an economy that's functioning, it's just not meeting the needs of so many of our workforce. And that's part of that mental model shift is, yes, you can have these macro numbers that for decades have been strong indicators about people's perception of the economy, but that just doesn't seem to be the case anymore. And so what's the new sort of measures we should be looking at? What's the new indicators that would give us some sense as to what's happening in people's lives? And this is where some of the the mental model shifting that we're seeing in drips and drabs, both from folks we work with, but also others that are starting to really say, geez, we're thinking about this the wrong way. And if we keep doing the same thing, we're just going to generate the same results, which is huge discontents within our workforce, right? Gallup does employee engagement. It's just been plummeting. I think there was a slight uptick last year, but it's at almost historic lows. We're seeing folks that are, we have all of these sort of derogatory terms for workers, whether quiet quitting, they're, lazy girl boss. I mean, I think there was one that sent me off the deep end last year talking about dead zone workers, which basically was like, oh, you mean people that go pick up their kids because they can't afford childcare? Like, and to sort of, so we have this sort of infrastructure that uses these catchphrases that just fundamentally say, well, it's the workers that need to be fixed, not the systems or the employers that need to rethink their approaches. And so that's also part of the mental model shift, which is we need the workplaces to rethink what they do, because continually trying to berate and convince workers that they're the problem is not a recipe for a successful or happy American workforce.
Yeah. It's so we I think all three of us and many of our listeners know the impact of stories, and especially when you're in your case, I know, Matt, kind of combining the storytelling plus data and having that sort of formula. I'm curious, you were just talking about, that you're seeing some things in drips and drabs, right? That there's some shift in that mental model. What's an impactful story that you've heard fairly recently or seen that you feel has kind of helped move that needle?
Sure. I think there's a couple.
Great.
And keep in mind, I think drips and drabs is exactly the right way to say it, because we are
Very sophisticated term.
The faucet is not on yet by any stretch of the imagination. But I think there's a few things. So one would be a really tangible example. So PayPal, for example. So back in 2018, PayPal decided that they wanted to better understand the financial health of their workforce. This was a company whose mission is about, democratizing financial services. So it's part and parcel. And so they focused on some of their contact center folks. And what they found was, despite the fact that they had market-based compensation data and used a lot of market-based benchmarking for their benefits, they saw that a huge percentage of their folks in those contact centers were struggling significantly financially. And so this really, and I give, Dan Schulman, who's since retired, a lot of credit for saying, this is just not acceptable. What are we not taking into account? And so this led to the development of a new compensation metric called estimated net disposable income. And so let me break this down a little bit, because it can get a bit nerdy and wonky, but I think it's a good example. So many employers will set their compensation bands based upon market-based compensation surveys, right? So you'll use a survey company and it'll give you sort of the 10%, the 90%, the midpoint. And then, employers who believe that they're sort of best in class, they'll often try to be, well, we're going to be above the sort of market, right? We're going to price above. And this was PayPal, right? They priced above market to do that. What I think companies are realizing is, well, what are market-based compensation surveys really telling me? And what they really tell you is, what do I need to pay to get labor in the door, right? So, and oh, by the way, looking at market-based compensation, unless you've been in the top 10% of income earners, that 50-year market history largely reflects stagnation. And so, yeah, that may be what gets labor in the door, because that's just what the market has sort of generated, but it doesn't tell you what impact your packages have on people's lives. It doesn't tell them how far they get. So you take a deviation beyond sort of market-based compensation. You start thinking about, well, let's think about, what does a living wage mean? And there are lots of definitions of living wage, but fundamentally a living wage is a minimum subsistence wage. It's what do people need to make in order just to have all of their essential needs met. And Amy Glassmeyer at MIT has data that's public on her website. Any employer can go look, and you can just, as part of your normal compensation plan, say, well, geez, okay, here's where we pay our workers. We know we have a high percentage of our workforce in this zip code. Well, what's that living wage in that zip code? And you can go look and you can say, well, geez, how well are we actually doing? So PayPal started to look at this, and what they realized that we just don't want to provide a minimum subsistence, right? It's not just about allowing them to live. We want to provide something that allows people to thrive in order to achieve some semblance of financial health. And so they set a benchmark very publicly that they wanted to have, at the end of all essential and necessary expenses for the month, they wanted their workforce to have 20% left over, 20% left over that they could use to save for a home, to, contribute to a retirement account, take their family on a vacation, live a decent, solid middle-class life. And they've achieved tremendous. I don't know exactly where their numbers were. I think inflation set them back a bit, but they were like 16, 18% of where they were. And so to me, that's an example of a complete mental model shift, which is, yes, we want to know what the market is happening because we have to sort of baseline ourselves, but we should really be focusing, if we are committed to the financial health of our workforce, what do they need in order to thrive? What does that actually look like? The other thing that they did is they made every full-time employee a shareholder. So as the company does better, those help creating the value also do better. And that leads to, I think, a second really interesting model, which is Ownership Works. So Ownership Works is a nonprofit organization that sort of was born out of KKR. And I think it's the first or second largest private equity firm. Pete Stavros, this was sort of his brainchild. Pete's got a really interesting background as well. And what they do is, within some of the KKR private equity portfolio companies, as well as other private equity firms that are now participating, they design employee equity programs. So when the private equity firm exits, meaning they transition the business, other investors, goes public, whatever the case, it actually creates an ownership payout to the workers who created that value. And I think it's a really novel and interesting way about how do you align, to use my phrase, sort of capital and labor in ways it is aligned about creating business value. And when folks share in that business value creation, it's amazing to see the stories. Ownership Works website has some videos that, if they don't speak to you, nothing will speak to you. Like, I just don't know. You lack humanity would be the way that I would say it. And it's a beautiful thing. So that to me is a real exercise in, like, how do we get more people sharing in the value they help create, right? That to me is a mental model shift. Workers not risks, but workers are owners of the business that they help create. That's a mental model shift. And so those would be two, I think, really salient examples. Certainly our work, complements and, we support those organizations. But even in our own work, the Worker Financial Wellness Initiative, which is a partnership we had with PayPal, Just Capital, and the Good Jobs Institute over the last 3 years. And initially, the goal of that entire initiative was just measure, just companies, just take a peek under the hood. We didn't make any recommendations about what solutions to offer, et cetera. Well, in the 3 years that program has been going, over 200,000 workers have seen living wage adjustments. We didn't tell them to make living wage adjustments, but once companies sort of see what's actually happening and they understand, particularly at the executive level, what's happening in their workforce, it's almost hard not to act. Because most business leaders that I've interacted with are not ghoulish, mustache twisting, villains. They really do care about their people. They often just don't know what's happening. And so that's another example of just the simple act of understanding what's happening in your people's lives, getting away from spreadsheets, and God forbid, actually talking to a worker, can be an exercise in shifting that mental model. Into moving towards a more humane sort of approach to designing your benefit programs. Not every employer's PayPal, not every employer, some of the other ones, but there are no shortage of models and examples of even low margin businesses that are able to do these things. It may require a little more work and a little more effort, but I think that's going to be something that we're going to continue to support and advocate for in our work.
Yeah. No, and I've been kind of vigorously nodding as you were talking, because one of the things that just appeared very clearly to me as you were talking about these two examples, just the value of measuring things, and we're constantly in our field hearing about employee engagement surveys, employee wellness surveys, well-being, all these things, but actually. So that kind of shows me that there's the capacity for organizations to measure things. It's there, and so what you're talking about is, hey, let's measure this over here. Let's measure that financial health, that financial wellness. And, obviously your organization helps to do that. But it's very clear to me that it's not like this far-fetched thing that requires a huge amount of innovation. And it's really, now I kind of get what I'm sort of coming around to what you were talking about earlier in terms of the that mental model shift. That's really what all it takes, all quote unquote. It's difficult, but it's that mindset. It's sort of shifting. Where do I look? I've looked over here for many, many, many years, and that's been great. And we'll just keep doing that. But hang on a second, that's not actually, it doesn't seem to be making our workers happy. So it's worth looking at these other measurements. And then once you do see it, once you see that data, it's very difficult to ignore. And I love what you said about these owners and founders, et cetera, CEOs who are looking at this and I had no idea. And I believe that. I actually believe that. I believe that it's sincere, and that, as long as you don't see the data, how are you supposed to make any kind of change? You really do need to start there. And then you start to see the results and you keep measuring. Anyway, that's I'm getting up there on the soapbox with you. And so I don't really have a question, but it's just more of a, you've certainly
Disrupting the
enlightened something.
assumptions.
Yeah, exactly.
Disrupting.
Yeah. We've been operating on the same set of assumptions and tools for the last decades, and clearly something needs to change. And I'm it's very clear to me that that's what your organization does and is there to do, is to sort of push these messages and these measurements and this data so that we can finally start to see those incremental changes.
Yeah. And it's also, we're a small nonprofit.
Yeah.
And so much of our work is also, how do we influence not just the employers, but those who support the employers? I think about the role of benefit consultants. They're hugely important. And they have a key role to play in helping their employers reimagine what is possible. And in some ways, that's really where I see our work, both what we've learned over the last 3 years since we spoke, but as I see the next 3 years of our work. And hopefully I'm back here before 3 years, but if it's another 3-year period, maybe that just becomes that's our new mental model, is every 3 years.
Exactly.
But I think it's really about, it's not just, you can go one employer by one employer and see impact stories. But if you're really trying to wholesale shift the mental models, it's a whole bigger range of stakeholders. And so a lot of the work we also do at the Financial Health Network is partnerships. Like we are not an organization that's going to solve this alone. And frankly, no organization is going to solve this alone. But how do we get coalitions? How do we work together through peers, partners, other organizations? Because that's actually how the mental models scale. And so, certainly we do a tremendous amount of work. We put a lot of ideas out there. We are on the leading edge of sort of the next evolution of innovation in terms of financial health. But we need partners, and we need folks who are committed to understanding, to deepening, to recognize that, things do kind of stink right now. And boy, I don't feel good about, what's happening in my organization, or geez, I think, why can't we do better? And, certainly human nature may play a role in here. It's, people people on a track. This is what we've always done it, and doing and learning new things can be hard, and it can be scary for folks. And so we also want to provide opportunities for people to experiment, to have conversations with their peers who are like, I'm wrestling with this. I don't know how to convince my CFO that this is a good idea. I don't know how to convince my CEO. How do I talk to my board about these ideas? And the reality is, there's no shortage of insights. There's no shortage of proof. Some of it is just, frankly, is there enough courage in the tank to go take some swings at this? And that's always hard. And so I don't want to diminish. I make it sound easy because I get to think about this all the time, and I'm paid to think about this all the time. But I don't diminish the lift that a lot of these things do require of people.
But you're helping people achieve their voice and giving them the tools and the language to move that. Now, you've managed in the last 30 minutes to unsuppress memories of bad salary surveys from my past when I was recruiting and saying, where did this data come from? It's totally unrealistic. But we had an episode, I don't know, it was last week, the week before, about being intentional. And I'm wondering, since you're saying small, feisty organization raising awareness, what stage would you like to be on in the next year? A big, hairy goal so you can raise your voice and expand your collaborations?
Yeah. It's a great question. This is going to sound egotistical, so I don't know any other way to say it. Which is like, I get invited to lots of stages. And so to me, it's not necessarily about like which stage I'm on, but how many stages are people with a similar messaging. And to me, that's where I see it. Like, I'd like to see, it doesn't have to be me, it could be any of our partners, any leaders, thinkers, that are on, stages in front of CEOs that are, talking on, cable news about these ideas. Despite, some of the trends we're seeing around the demise and decline of cable news, it still has an outsized influence on the narratives. I think those are what's really important. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm not thinking, like, geez, what stage should I be in? It's like, well, I can get on stages. It's not like I'm sitting there thinking, geez, I really wish I could speak here. It's more of like, I need more people to be speaking about this, not me being the one that's doing the circuit.
Like amplifying that message.
Connecting the dots.
Connecting the dots, yeah. And in their own ways. I mean, people don't have to, I don't pretend that I've got all the answers, or that everything that the world is not dynamic and there's not changes in nuance and criticism. Like, all of those things are really important. And we should be having those conversations. We should be having these debates. But I think part of that systems change is like, how do we scale the mental model? And that's really where I'm focused over the next years, is how do we get people to really truly start to think differently, to operate with a different set of assumptions, and to really just open the aperture for what is possible. Because work doesn't have to suck as much as it does. It just doesn't. And in some ways, we've just chosen for it to suck because we've operated with some outdated software.
Yeah. No, I love that. We're getting close to the end of our time, shockingly, because this has been really engaging and stimulating. There's a question that we ask of all our guests, and it's always the same. And I'd like to ask you as well, if you could tell us about an experience that has shaped who you are today, or still influences perhaps all the different kinds of ideas that you talked about today and your work.
Yeah, I'm really lucky that I get inspired every week, it seems like. But there's one experience that happened since we last spoke that I really want to, and folks can actually go watch this. It's on our website at the Financial Network. We did a panel back in 2021. So it must have been right after we spoke. We did this sort of virtual conference, and we had a panel of 2 frontline workers, and they came and sort of just talked about their life. And it was amazing because, like, our audience is pretty sophisticated in the sense of like a lot of fintechs, a lot of nerds, people. And we had folks in our audience who were asking these frontline workers about all these cool innovations that were coming into the market. And, what do you think about this? Would this be good? And the workers were just so human. They're like, well, yeah, that all sounds good, but I'd just like to make like $1 more an hour so I can afford my rent. And yeah, I'd like to not have to work an extra shift for Uber, and that my job would pay me enough to do that. So to me, I would encourage folks to go just watch that video. Particularly if you're listening to this podcast, I assume you may live in a bubble potentially, and you don't interact a lot with folks who, maybe aren't in your same social circles, or, have your same education level, or work in the same professions that you do. And I think we just need so much more of that. So that would be one. The other one is, I live in a small town on the coast of Maine. And it is a working class town. And 70% of the kids in the lunch here qualify for free or reduced federal lunch. So like, it's a town full of real people living their lives. And last year, when I forget the name of the bank, Silicon Valley Bank was collapsing. I was down at the local diner, and I saw a carpenter friend of mine, and his wife's a certified nursing assistant at the hospital. And we were sitting there having a cup of coffee and catching up. And I sort of point to the TV and I say, what do you think about this? What's your thought on this? And he looks at me and he goes, it's pretty amazing that within 48 hours, we were able to come up with all this money to help bail out this bank. But I used to get a check from the government that was like $600 a month, and that just went away. He was talking about the child tax credit that went away. And so that to me is a really instructive example of, real people in the real world are watching, and they're seeing how swiftly and how quickly we will mobilize as a country to solve challenges for banks. And I think that's important, right? I don't want to diminish the role of banks, and that's hugely important. But that comes right on the heels of this program that they maybe didn't fully know the details of, but they knew that, hey, I was getting some support. I was able to put food on the table. I could pay for my kids there. I could go on a date with my wife, God forbid. And that just went away. And geez, wouldn't it be nice if, someone would come into my life and make my life just a little bit easier? And that's not, an argument for, and he was not arguing for like, geez, we need more like large scale government programs. It was just something like, yeah, people are busy living their lives. They're not following all the machinations that are happening. But what they see is like, geez, this seems to be a big deal, like doing this. But, all I see is like a bunch of rich people getting more money. And like, I'm sitting here now and I just lost $600 a month and I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to make my rent next month. Like that's real. And that really happens. So that would be two stories of like, we just have got to get out and actually interact with normal people.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's what's important.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think it also, it just shows the power of, again, I know we've talked about this, but that combination of the stories and the data, keep measuring and then listen to the stories and get those stories out there, amplify that message. And my hope is that this interview, this podcast can also contribute to that conversation happening. And as you said, I think you're right. A lot of our listeners, including me, honestly, I mean, these are not topics that are front of mind necessarily. And yet there's something, I think you certainly enlightened me in many ways about things that were kind of there in the back of my mind, because we do think about these things. We think about higher education, we think about debt, we think about all these things that we want for our, in my case, for my kids, and so what kind of world are they going to be in once it's their turn to go out there and get a job? So yeah, I think this has been really tremendously helpful. I wonder, you've pointed to a few resources already, but is there anything that you would want to leave our audience with? We'll definitely point to those videos you talked about on the website. But is there anything else that you would want to point people to?
Yeah. So Financial Health Network is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. We are hosting a conference in Chicago early June. If you're curious about the financial health movement, you want to learn more about it, certainly I think our website is the best since we in many ways birthed the financial health movement. Not alone, we had a lot of great partners and supporters that helped do that. But if you're looking for a conference to attend this year, and you want to start thinking about how to be a force for change and making work and financial services better for more people, come hang out with us in Chicago in June. I think that could be a great place.
Great. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Matt. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us again, and so great to also hear about the evolution and what you're all thinking about. So I wanna thank you as well, Jules, for being with me.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, and if you listeners have been inspired by this session, please do consider enrolling yourself and or your team in one of our workshops. We do have a workshop open to individuals starting in mid-February. The February 15 exactly. And that's going to be 4 60-minute sessions online. And it's really designed for you to create your own compelling leadership story. So you can go to narrative.com to find out more about that. And of course, you can find out a lot more on our website. We've got a blog, we've got this podcast that's there. You can go into our archive and really you'll find just about anything there for free. So as always, thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Go to YouTube as well, because we've got our YouTube channel and you'll find our episodes there too. This all drives the word of mouth. So thanks so much for doing that, and really can't wait for the next one. Thanks, Julienne, again, and thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Jerome, and I look forward to seeing everybody in our workshops or online again. So take care.
For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narrative.com.